We chose Kim for this jazz connector because Kim has a rather unique and ultimately very important perspective on funding, because Kim is first and foremost an artist. Kim has made many funding applications in many different capacities, actually, not just as an artist. And I haven't asked her this, but I'm sure Kim has been both successful and unsuccessful in funding applications like all of us. Kim is also a programmer at the Vortex in London, where she sees a lot of music. And some of the artists programmed there are probably grantee recipients that are looking for a space to perform maybe their grant aided or grant associated material. Most crucially for the discussion today, Kim also works for Arts Council England, where she directly assesses many applications, and so she has a very unique insight on that. And then finally, she's the chair of Jazz Promotion Network, which is a network for jazz professionals, both voluntary organizations, musicians, etc., throughout Scotland, Ireland, England, and Wales. So it's destined to be an international network in just a few short weeks, I would imagine, but we won't get into that today. So this will be a very practical session with information and tips from somebody who makes applications, somebody who receives applications, and has a part in awarding recipients based on governmental criteria, which is very similar to how things work here. And while there are some differences in how national arts councils work, how they're funded, the advice today, I would imagine, should cover all of the practical elements and can be considered universal. So one last bit of housekeeping for me before I hand you over to Kim is we have a funding calendar. IMC has a kind of you can subscribe to a Google Calendar, which has a list of all of the upcoming funding, not just from the Arts Council, but from whatever pots are available. And it's updated regularly by us, and there's a link to it in the chat right now. So we would encourage everybody to sign up to that. And as I said at the top, the more musicians from our sector that are applying for all of these grants, the better the profile that we have, and the better the opportunities for you as artists. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand you over to Kim Macari. And thanks, Kim. Great to have you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so like Kenneth said, if you have questions, just fire them into the chat. Now and again, I'll have a look to see whether they make sense to kind of answer as we go through, or we've allocated some time at the end where we can talk through questions and hopefully have a little bit of a conversation. Yeah, so I thought it might be useful just to expand a little bit on my position and how I got to this position. And then we can start getting into the kind of practical stuff about writing strong applications and budgets and decision making and that sort of thing. So like Kenneth said, I'm an artist myself, so I'm an improvising trumpet player, and I work fairly exclusively in improvised music, and as a composer, I work with graphic scores, data sonification, and ekphrasis. So my practice kind of straddles music and visual arts. But kind of throughout my professional career as an artist, I've also been involved in the kind of infrastructure side and the industry side. So I began programming live events, I think, while I was still studying. So I studied at Leeds Conservatoire, and I started programming events on a kind of ad hoc basis, really just trying to find a space to put on the music that I wanted to play and wanted to hear. And then that became a little bit more formalized once I left. I started programming a venue. It was a community art space. It was actually a former primary school that the community had come together and bought and then turned into an art centre. So I programmed there. It was kind of monthly live events. And then moved to London, and for the past kind of 2 or 3 years I've been programming at the Vortex. So the Vortex programs around 400 shows a year, so right through the year and all through the week. Is a relatively small space, so capacity is about 100 to 115, and programs quite broadly, although obviously with under the banner of jazz and improvised music, and probably its reputation as a kind of treasured space for artists to play is kind of more on the improvised side. So we, you know, for example, we have people like Evan Parker do a monthly residency, and people, Dave Holland programs a series of events there. So it's been running for over 30 years and is a kind of internationally recognized space. So for me as a programmer, it's been a really fun thing to do, although incredibly challenging to be programming such a wide and full-on program. Since lockdown has hit, we obviously stopped our programming and we were awarded some cultural recovery money, which was the kind of reactive fund set up to support the arts through COVID, and we used that to essentially to purchase streaming equipment to enable us to stream events behind closed doors, and also to kind of upgrade our sound equipment just to kind of professionalize our digital output. So we're now streaming a couple of shows a week, and we're a lot more kind of set up to be quite nimble. So as the restrictions change, we're kind of able to have plan A's and plan B's and plan C's. So we do what we can in that capacity. I have been writing funding applications probably since just after I graduated from studying, from little kind of small local authority or kind of charities that support specific activities. I applied for some funds in my final year in my degree to go and study. I wrote a performance art piece about the Outer Hebrides and had some support to go and spend some time there. And then kind of moved quite fluidly on into the Arts Council grants and their kind of broad open platform system for applications. And then I've also written kind of a number of organisational bids, both in England but also in Scotland, and have assessed applications in Scotland. And for about the last 18 months, I've worked directly with Arts Council England. So my role there is, well, I'm the strategic lead for jazz and improvised music, which means I work on the kind of national strategy for jazz and improvised music, get to kind of create a plan, try to understand what the landscape is, what we're supporting and what we could be supporting more, kind of identify trends that we're seeing in our art form as it compares to others, and make sure kind of from a lobbying perspective that jazz and improvised music is supported within the Arts Council as best as it can be. The other half of my work, as Kenneth said, is directly related to making funding decisions. So as well as any application that includes jazz and improvised music will come to me in some form, either just to make a comment on it. So I provide kind of contextual information about the application and about the applicants. And I also sit on decision panels where I assess not only jazz and improvised music, but indeed applications from all art forms. And so that includes kind of our smaller level, which is £15,000 and under, to the next level up, which is 15,000 to 100,000. And then a number of our kind of strategic funds that we have, developing your creative practice as one example. So that's for individual practitioners to support a big step change in their work. So my position at the Arts Council is really a kind of point of intersection between kind of the arts and policy. And obviously in the last year, that's been highlighted even more so because of the way that we've worked to support the cultural sector through COVID. So I was involved in the kind of discussions and the building of the Cultural Recovery Fund, which we then received sector support from the government to support organisations, cultural organisations. So we were involved in assessing those applications, which were very different. It's the first time we've ever assessed an application on hardship rather than on our normal criteria. The first time that we've accepted applications from the commercial sector. and the first time that we've ever offered repayable loans as one of the options, as well as grants. And it was an interesting time to be part of the Arts Council, because as you can imagine, Arts Councils tend to move quite glacially, and the discussions that are had around new funds or changes to funds tend to take place over a very large amount of time. But everyone had to move incredibly quickly this year, and it was heartening to see that that can happen, and also that it can happen actually quite efficiently, and hopefully that kind of feeds into our more long-term work, so everything doesn't take quite as long as it has done in the past. So I think a lot of my job is being a translator. As someone who's an artist, I understand kind of my peers in my artist community. I understand their perceptions and their experiences of funding. And firsthand as an applicant, and as Kenneth said, I've been both successful and unsuccessful. And going into working with the Arts Council, I had ideas about trends that I had seen anecdotally. What's been really useful was then to have access to lots of data to figure out whether those are actually backed up and what we can use that data to actually do to improve how we support the sector. So translating what funders mean to artists is something that I really like to do. And we give lots of advice sessions, and that's certainly something that I really enjoy, kind of demystifying the process. But also translating the kind of needs and opinions and challenges of the artistic community to the funders is equally important. And so being able to be a voice for that community, specifically individual artists, where we see lots and lots of individual artist applications for music, probably more so than the other art forms. And there are a kind of unique set of challenges with freelance creatives, and indeed within the music industry. So being a point of information about that. So sometimes we're called to give evidence for select committees by government. Sometimes we're asked for specific data or case studies by our cultural department. So being able to be involved in that as well. So with all of that in mind, I prepared some stuff for us to work through today, which really looks at, and I've tried to be as universal as possible, so this shouldn't apply just to the funds that I distribute, but should be pretty universal in terms of fund that you apply for. Some tips about how to, how to make a strong application. I want to take a look at some jargon and try to figure out what the perceptions of these words that we see, words and phrases we see come up all the time. And also I want to talk through a little bit about the decision-making process that I go through, just so that you can sort of see what happens when your application is submitted, the sort of thought processes that we have that kind of lead to various outcomes. And then I'm more than happy to field either kind of broad questions or quite specific questions that you have about any of those things. So what I'm going to do is share my screen to show you a couple of slides. The first of which is really broadly just some kind of tips for funding. Let's go from the beginning. Yeah, there we go. Now, I might make that a little bit bigger. Oh, that's not bigger. Okay, so I'm just going to talk through each of these, and these are kind of big things that I see happen all the time. The first of which is don't assume knowledge. And this is really important. So as I said, I assess applications from all art forms, not just from music. And an enormous amount of applications make assumptions that the people assessing them will be very familiar with the field or the art form that they're from. And actually that's not always the case. So the way that it works at Arts Council England is we have a panel of usually 3 people, and that will be any number of combinations of people from literature, dance, theatre, music, visual arts. And so it's really important to not assume that you are talking to someone who has a kind of large understanding. about what you're talking about. And so we see this a lot with people using lots of acronyms that they never give us the full title, so we don't know what they're referring to, or they make references to specific events or people without kind of providing context. And it's very hard without us doing our own research then for us to get an understanding of what people are actually trying to get across. And just as a point of kind of time management, we cannot give that extra time to research every application. So as I'm sure you'll appreciate, every fund like this will have an issue with supply and demand, and we always have more applications than we can fund. And part of our job as decision makers, unfortunately, is making decisions about who will not receive funding. So we're looking for weaknesses. And if an application seems kind of impenetrable with assumed knowledge, it's very easy to write that application off. So I would suggest to kind of offset that, and also to move on to the second point, to have someone read over your application before you submit it. And the less they know about your work or the funding structure or anything that you're involved in, the better. So you just want someone to read what you've written and take it at face value. And you'll often find that they'll have questions that you didn't think of because you're so immersed in this world and immersed in the idea that you're applying for funding for, that there are things that you might have looked over and felt like they are common sense, links that you might have felt are quite clearly made, but someone else reading them might highlight that that's not particularly clear. So it's really useful to have someone read over your work before you submit it. Also, I think you spend so long with a funding application, you get kind of snowblind and you stop being able to see what's good and what's bad anymore. So I definitely suggest having someone read over the work before. The next point is one just to sort of offset the emotional roller coaster of successes and failures in funding applications, is to kind of look at a more kind of broad and strategic way of thinking about funding. So if you have a kind of file on your computer where you keep kind of strong answers to questions that you just see come up over and over again, it's going to limit the amount of time that it takes you to apply for funds, but it's also going to mean that the work you've put into a funding application doesn't feel like it's lost if you don't receive that funding, that the work that you've done can be put to use in somewhere else. You're always going to be asked to talk about your track record and your experience. You're always going to be asked to give details about your work and what you want the project to do. You're almost always going to be asked about some form of public engagement, or how are you going to let people know about your project. And working to kind of refine your answers to those so that they are very concise and very clear. Don't let that go to waste, just keep that somewhere. And then it's just a case of when a funding opportunity comes up, you can look at your resources and the majority of the application can be filled in for you with answers from another application. And you might just have to tweak to fit, or you might just have to add a couple things in. But just to make sure that it doesn't feel like you are putting an enormous amount of work in every time you do an application. Because the thing is that you have to apply for lots and lots of things in order to get a small number of them. And I definitely suggest that funding should become just woven into a part of your, kind of creative practice. And so the more prepared you are to fit that in, and the time it takes, the more prepared you are to kind of grab opportunities when they come. The next point, to use bullet points and lists. So I have never come across a fund in which prose and paragraphs are one of the criteria with which they're assessed, but every fund I've come across have tight word counts and ask for you to provide a lot of information in a very short space of time. Now, as a decision maker, you can imagine that when I am about to go to a decision-making panel, I'll be given a batch of applications to assess, usually between 30 and 50, but in some cases more. So the panel I have next week has 199 applications. Now, those applications are structured in exactly the same way. And reading them all, it becomes quite clear that things kind of merge into one another. And if I have to look through quite a dense paragraph of information to find the answer to the question, then again, I'm gonna maybe give a little bit less time to that application. Whereas someone that uses bullet points and uses lists, not only are you kind of being more economical with your word counts, you're also making sure that the important information jumps out. So myself and the majority of my colleagues that are decision makers definitely prefer bullet points and lists. You just have, in terms of, you know, making it make sense, don't worry about long and elaborate sentences. Just give us lists of information. That's all we're trying to, because we have a tiny amount of time to look at each one. And so you're improving your chances of getting your point across very quickly if you use those bullet points and lists. The next point is a piece of advice that I give quite often, which is that a funder should be able to read your application and deliver your project. So when I receive an application, the information that it contains should allow me to just take it and deliver that work. So I should know what it is, what it's trying to achieve, how it's going to work logistically, who the other people are that are involved, who the project's for, how those people are going to be reached, what the sort of timeline of the project and the deadlines of the project are. I should just be able to do it myself. And if I read an application and there are still question marks about how some of it's going to work, then it means that your application's missed out some really important information. So your application then is a kind of map to delivering your project. And it should be clear enough that not just you can deliver it. I think that's really useful to kind of keep in mind as you're kind of reading over your work before you submit it. The next point, making a compelling case for your project is far more important than saying or doing things you think are fundable. And the sort of related point is that you should find funding for an idea rather than find an idea to fit funding. It's really obvious to decision makers if you have written an application that you've found a pot of money and you want to access the money, but you're trying to find an idea that fits. You're kind of building it as you're writing it. That comes across. Speaking passionately and articulately about a project that you clearly believe in does come across. And because it's often the first question that's asked about, tell us what your project is. You can see clearly whether it's something that's been really well thought through, whether it's something that, you know, there's genuine belief by the applicant that this is an important project. And then you have applications where there are things that feel like they've just been stuck on. For example, someone wants to do a tour, but they feel like it's going to be more fundable if they have some workshops in it. And they're not necessarily interested in the workshops. They might not have had much experience in doing the workshops, but they want to add them in because they feel like it makes them a more fundable proposition. But the fact is that although, yeah, I mean, participation is important, it has to be kind of authentic and sincere participation. And it is clear when someone's kind of added those things in. And it's also clear when someone's written an application where they've tried to say the things they think funders want to hear. And they often miss the mark. And again, it's just to bear in mind that arts funders presumably got into their job because they want to give money to arts projects. They don't want to kind of find obstacles to artists receiving funding. Although they have to work in parameters where they're dealing with tight budgets and they do have to make difficult decisions, at the core of it, they want to support good projects. And so someone talking really passionately about a project is definitely going to stick in someone's memory. It's going to make a decision maker more likely to sort of advocate for that funding when it goes to a panel. So those, I would suggest, are the kind of the strongest things to have in mind when you're writing an application. And after the session, we'll make sure that the IMC kind of circulate this information to you so you can have it. But the next thing to look at is to look at how I make decisions. And so this might be slightly different depending on which fund it is, but I think it will give you a sense of the order of thinking that goes on. So this is essentially the journey after you submit your application. The first thing that happens is it's determined whether it's eligible or not. And it might be ineligible because it doesn't fit the criteria that was asked for. Often it's ineligible because there's a problem with the budget. So often the problem is expenditure or income outweighs expenditure or income. So there's the budget's not balanced. One figure is higher than the other. That is ineligible, and it'll be bounced back to the applicant. So that's a very easy thing that wouldn't be taken further, wouldn't be taken to a panel. If an application is very underdeveloped, so if it feels like it's so underdeveloped that it wouldn't stand a chance against other applications, it would be deemed ineligible as well, and it would be bounced back. But assuming that your application is eligible, this is what happens to it when I'm given it. So like I said, I will be given a big batch of applications, usually between sort of 30 and 50. And the way it works at Arts Council England is we're given a specific budget for our individual decision meeting. So we'll be told, this is the amount of money that all of your applications combined are asking for, and this is the amount of money you have to spend, which obviously then determines the success rate. And I'm sure you will be aware, and I'm sure it's not just Arts Council England, but the demand for funding is enormous at the moment. And so we've seen success rates plummet. We have a 90% increase in demand since we reopened the funds in October. And our success rates are very low at the moment. So they are kind of between 10 and 15%, when we'd usually see them at about 40, which means we're making very difficult decisions. And it also means we're rejecting very strong applications. So what I do is I have a first read through, and I read through all of the applications and I mark any that stand out strongly, either one way or the other. Those that stand out because they're really good, and those that stand out because they're really bad. And that you can usually get a sense of that on a first read through, really. And so at the end of that first read through, I'll then have 3 piles. I'll have a pile that I would strongly prefer to fund. I'd have a pile that I'd strongly prefer not to. And then I'd have a pile in the middle where they haven't jumped out at me for good or bad in my first read through. So those that I don't want to fund, at that point, I'll decide on a rejection reason. So this is something that probably will change depending on what funder it is, but how we work is that we give a specific reason for rejection. And those reasons they're set, they are from a list of options, they're not kind of free-form reasons. And it's usually that it points to a specific bit of your application, so one of the sections that we assess, or its other applications are preferred. And so other applications preferred means your application is absolutely fine and fundable, but when it got to comparing it like for like with another application, for reasons I'll go on to in a second, we've decided to go with another one. So the reason I make these rejection reasons now is to save time in the actual meeting. So we usually only have about 2 or 3 hours in a decision meeting, and if we're getting through kind of 50 applications, then we need to be very efficient with our time. So I'll have a reason ready for why I strongly prefer not to fund this application. And then the ones I strongly prefer, I'll kind of keep them to one side. And so my middle group, my no preference group, now those applications are what we as decision makers spend the majority of our time on. So it's usually the case that the decision makers agree broadly on the ones that are really good and the ones that are really bad. It's the ones in the middle that we spend most time discussing. Those that are okay, those that might be a little bit shaky in one area, but might be okay in another. Those that one of the decision makers who has a lot of contextual information about an art form might be able to shed a bit of light on and say, oh no, actually, yeah, I know that application isn't the best, it doesn't read particularly well, but that is one of our priorities, is to support kind of people who haven't applied before, so they might not know how to put together a good application, or they've kind of missed the mark on something, but we feel confident in kind of advocating for it. So on my second read through, I'm looking at the ones I had no preference for, and I'm trying to determine, which side do they fall on? Are they okay or are they not okay? So the sorts of things I'm thinking about are any from this pile first-time applicants? So we want people to be first-time applicants and to start relationships with funders, but we know that if you've never applied before, you might not know how to deliver a strong application to us. So I might be more lenient with an application which isn't presented particularly well, but sounds like a good idea if it comes from a first-time applicant, than someone who I see has had a history of applying. The second point, can I research any that show potential to understand context? And that's what I said before about if I had an application that came from visual arts, then I might ask a colleague in the visual arts team about that applicant or that project, and just get a bit of information that might help me make a decision one way or the other. Which applications meet our balancing criteria? And this is an important point because as applicants, there's a lot you can do to make your application good, but there's also a lot that is out with your control. And those are the kind of internal criteria that funders have to make decisions. And so our balancing criteria and our priorities are those which you can't influence, but do influence our decision making. So it might be that we want to make sure we have a good spread across all the art forms in a meeting if it's multi-art form, or across the genres if it's kind of specifically music. It might be that we want to make sure we're supporting groups that are underrepresented. It might be that we have identified that we don't receive as many applications from female creative leaders, so we want to kind of preference those applications. Might be that we want to support more applications from disabled creative professionals, and those might receive preference. And so that's a consideration when we're really looking at the detail that we would look at. And the last point is quite an important one as well. Do any of the applications show potential and feel low risk enough to take a chance? So the nice thing about kind of smaller pots of money is that you can be a bit more, you can take a bit more risk with them. And some applications might feel a little bit underdeveloped. They might feel a little bit like, you know, they could have been presented better, but it's a fairly small ask, and, you know, it's in an art form we want to do more with, so we'll take a chance on it. And that might be something that we'd look at if an application didn't really hit the sort of gold star standard, but we do feel like for another reason we want to give it a go. So that results in a further 2 piles. I've got a preferred pile and a prefer not to pile. For both of those, I find rejection reasons, because I know that the budget's isn't going to allow me to fund everything I strongly prefer and prefer. So I've got to be ready to explain why these people didn't get their funding. And so this all happens, in my case, it happens by myself. All the decision makers do the same thing. And then we come into the meeting having done this work, and we basically have conversations about the middle pile of applications. And hopefully all the ones we strongly prefer receive offers, and some of the ones we prefer receive offers, and the rest receive rejection reasons. And I think it's useful, it certainly was very useful for me to understand in detail what the decision-making process is when I joined Arts Council, because again, as an applicant, I had ideas about what people were thinking and why people were making decisions, but it was really good to see how that works from the background. So I felt like that might be useful to you. I think what the flowchart shows is you want to be in a position where you're in the top pile on the first read. You want to be strongly prefer to fund. And that means that you work to make your application as strong as possible. If you are in the middle section, then there's a bit more of a risk that when you're compared directly to the other applications in your meeting, that you might fall down. And that is another thing to remember, is that it is compared to other people that have applied that day. So if you're applying for a tour, and in your meeting 7 other people have applied for tours, it might be that we can't fund all of those touring applications, but we might fund the best 2 or 3. But it might be that one meeting, yours is the only touring application. So you can see how there's a number of factors that you can't really influence, but that do influence your decision. Now, what I want to do is allow some people to actually speak aside from me. And I just want to look at some jargon. So I wonder if anyone could just like throw out their thoughts on when they see audience development in an application, what they think it means, and what they think, what they usually do when they answer a question about audience development. And I reckon because of this group is quite small, just turn your mics on and fire your answers out about audience development. What do people think when they read that?
Working with children, possibly educational things in schools.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. What else? Kenneth, what are your thoughts when you see audience development?
Well, underdeveloped audiences, under-resourced audiences, new audiences. I mean, it's a pretty huge area, you know. But it certainly is about, well, for me, audience development is about generating new audiences, but also keeping the existing audience going. So it's about identifying how to work on both tracks. But I think probably the most useful one is the underdeveloped audiences or the under-resourced audiences, or taking the content to new audiences, where like literally taking your content to move it to somewhere where, into an area where maybe they don't have that type of content available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think I tend to think of it, yeah, like you said, Kenneth, your existing audience and then new audiences. So for your existing audience, audience development could be about how do you make someone who comes to one of your gigs now and again, how do you kind of improve your relationship with that audience member to make them a more loyal audience? So they might come to every one of your gigs, or they might buy some of your albums, or they might support a crowdfunder campaign. So that's about developing the type of audience that you have. And then your new audience development is about identifying groups of people you think will like what you're doing and figuring out how to tell them that you're doing it and how to get them to come and see it. How about contingency? Does anyone have any thoughts or emotional responses to seeing the word contingency?
This year it's a bit kind of a big one, isn't it? I know everyone who's been planning, or at least we've been planning things for this year, trying to plan on quicksand. It makes contingency a big part. Now, the Arts Council, at least in my experience, I've only really applied for festival things. They inserted a contingency thing last year for the first time in the festival investment scheme, where you were supposed to have a pot of money for contingency, but that only came in last year, and I don't think they even did it again this year. I think it was a fleeting thing in the night. But I mean, what for my festival that I run, what I did this year was balance a budget 3 ways, because you can only ask for one amount of money. So I balanced a budget that worked entirely digital, partly digital, or entirely live, which was tough. But yeah. I don't think a lot of people were talking about that. And funding seminars this year were like from local authorities and things were saying you need to plan in your what's going to happen if we're still in lockdown, or what's going to happen if you need to have these contingencies in place. So I think this year it sort of has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess there's 2 sides to it. One is the contingency of your idea. So how are you going to make sure you can still deliver something if something changes? And then there's kind of financial contingency, which is a similar thing, which is is your budget robust enough to deal with any unforeseen costs, and as we've seen in the last year, many things can be unforeseen and then can appear all at the same time. So for a funder, evidence of contingency, either in your planning of your activity or in your finance, is evidence of planning and evidence of kind of risk management and risk assessment, that you've thought through the potential pitfalls, the potential obstacles that you might run into, and you have put something in place to make sure that you're okay if those come up. So if you're talking about, you know, making a decision about who gets some funding investment, if you see someone who's planned for lots of eventualities, you feel like that's a safe investment. Whereas if you don't see it, if you see that the budget only works if everything costs exactly as you've said it'll cost, then you know, based on experience, that is not usually the case. And they might then, that might put into jeopardy the ability to actually deliver something. So then that becomes a rather unsafe investment.
I'll just come in.
Yeah,
I'll just come in really quickly on that, because you know, I've looked at a lot of budgets for, you know, for artists, and from a fiscal perspective, the contingency is usually one of the first things to go in a budget. And I know we'll talk about the budget elements shortly, but I highly recommend calculating like a 7% of your overall expenditure as a contingency. Now you can float between like 4 to 7%, but if you don't have a contingency in your budget, I think it affects you negatively. It might increase your overall costs, but it's in the optics of it. I think that is very important. And I know we'll talk about budget shortly, but I will be doing creating a budget template, which we will share with the notes of this, which will auto calculate things like VAT, also auto calculate the percentage of overall expenditure as you're writing out the application to see if your budget is weighted. So I think contingency is actually critical. But I think your point actually about the artistic contingency, having some sort of modular element to the application to show that it can be still delivered, maybe if it didn't get the full amount, because in Ireland you can get a partial award. I think in England you get all or nothing, but in Ireland you can certainly get a partial award. So that modularity becomes even more important then, to be able to kind of be adaptable to the fund. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it, as a funder, if you are issuing partial awards, so I've been involved in decision making in Scotland. So Creative Scotland do a similar thing where they offer partial awards. If you're able to look at a project and understand what could be removed and still have something of high quality be delivered, that is a much easier decision than looking at a project and feeling like there's no, like it's kind of a really wobbly Jenga tower. There's nothing you could take out that wouldn't just make everything collapse, which again is another reason why you'd opt not to put the investment in there. On that kind of budget point then, support in kind, does anyone want to offer a kind of, how would you explain support in kind to someone who'd never heard that phrase before?
So that'd be if, say, you had an agreement with a venue or an art centre might give you the space to develop your work without charging you.
Yeah. So there, someone or some organisation is supporting your project, but not directly through cash, but giving some service. Yeah. So often it's venue usage or rehearsal space, or sometimes people offer their time or their services either for free or for reduced rates. So some, you know, PR companies or some graphic design companies might offer you a kind of lower rate because you're an individual artist. They might say, okay, this is what I'll charge you. It's like 40% of what we'd usually charge. And then that kind of shows that essentially what they're doing is giving you that, the equivalent 60%. And we'll come on to this when we talk about the budget, but with support in kind, it's really important that it appears on both sides of your budget. Support in kind is obviously income, but it needs to be shown in expenditure, otherwise your budget doesn't balance. And that's the thing, we see lots and lots of applications are deemed ineligible because of that exact thing, where your support in kind isn't reflected as a piece of expenditure. So we'll come on to how to avoid that in a second. Evidence of need is one that I see quite a lot come up in different funds, and I wonder if anyone would kind of take a punt at what evidence of need is and how you'd go about proving it in an application.
Well, evidence of need might be where you take a project to a particular geographical location where the audience there might not be able to sustain the project by ticket sales. So there would be a need for funding in order that that project gets into that particular geographical area. And yet, obviously, the project still has merit and should be brought to different locations where, as I say, the audience in that area might not be able to support the project, but it's still worthy of performance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And how about if it was like an individual artist and they were applying for funds, not to show specific work, but to do some development, what would be the evidence of need there? Does anyone know?
You talk about maybe adding on a workshop or a clinic again into an area by an artist?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I guess, so one of the things that you have to do in a funding application is to tell the funder why you deserve to be funded. But a really important question you should answer is, why should you be funded now? So if I have an application that feels like it would be fine if this came back into us in a few months' time, it's an easy decision for me to put that on the come back in pile. Whereas if an application makes a really compelling case for why this is the time for this event to happen, then that's really important. And that sort of evidence of need we see quite a lot. So it could be evidence of need, like you say, Dominic, about kind of geographical areas, like in England we call them cold spots, so areas that don't have lots and lots of cultural activity, but you want to bring work to that audience. That's kind of evidence of need of an audience. It could also be evidence of need of yourself. So it could be that you need this funding and it's the right time now because you have this specific opportunity that's arisen and you need some support to make it happen, but it has potential to really benefit you in the long term, and it's one that doesn't come along all the time. So that the stars have aligned and now is the time. So the evidence of need is that this is time specific, it's time sensitive, and it has lots of potential for your own development. And that's sort of evidence of need of the applicant, if you like.
I think that I think evidence of need, we don't see that jargon, that language, maybe expressed like that in some of the applications that Irish artists would be applying for. However, the evidence of need is kind of peppered throughout all applications. And I think if you ask some artists, they might say, well, sure, the evidence is I'm applying, I need the money.
Yeah.
I mean, why wouldn't I be applying if I didn't need it, But I think that what this is kind of saying to me is that, part of that zooming out, like on the chronology of an artist, maybe it's for money for, it could be the second part. You could have got a fund the prior year, let's say, to do something, and this is kind of the next step on it. So this is the chronology of the artist. And I think that if you zoom out and kind of talk about your work from that perspective, you're also providing that kind of bullet point stuff that the people assessing it, who may not know your work well at all, will have a better understanding of where you are in your career, specifically, and why this fund is important to you now. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'll do after this, so all of these phrases that I've mentioned, I'll give some kind of description to each of those to kind of circulate around, because I do think they're all really important points. But it'd be good then to move on to talking a little bit about the budget, since we've kind of touched on that a little bit, and then just give us a chance to have a chat about specific questions. So Kenneth said there'll be a template, which is great, which is incredibly useful for you to kind of use. But I just have a kind of couple of headline things just to bear in mind about budgets. The first point is one that I've kind of mentioned a couple of times already, which is that your budget has to balance. that means that your income and expenditure have to be the same amount. And I know that might feel to some of you like common sense, but it's very common that we see balanced budgets that don't balance. And it's often because something's just not been displayed properly rather than it actually doesn't balance. It's the way that information is being displayed, but it does mean that it's unfundable, because usually what happens is it looks like the income exceeds the expenditure. So it looks like you're receiving this amount of money and support in kind, but you're only spending this amount of money. And it seems like somewhere there's a floating amount that hasn't been accounted for. If that's the case, then that's an ineligible application, because it's not clear that you need that full amount of money because you haven't explained it to us. Often, as I said, that's when you refer to support in kind only in your income side. So you'll say that your income is whatever amount of money, and that's made up of this application that you're asking for, the ticket sales for whatever you're doing, and some support in kind. Someone's given you the rehearsal space for 3 days, but in your expenditure, you haven't listed 3 days worth of rehearsal. So it looks like someone's giving you something extra that's not being needed, which is is almost like profiting from the project, if that makes sense. So if you're given 3 days of rehearsal as support in kind, what you need to do is put a figure, a monetary figure, on that support in kind and reflect it in your expenditure. So in your expenditure, you will have rehearsal costs, 3 days rehearsal at £100 a day equals, this is my 300 of rehearsal costs. And then in the income, you'll have support in kind 300. And there it balances. But you have to make sure it is in the expenditure. Often people leave that out. It's the same if someone offers you their time. What you have to do is convert support in kind into a monetary value, which you then have in your expenditure, which once you get your head around is fine, but it feels very murky. I remember having a hard time getting to grips with what that actually meant, and different funds will have different ways that you kind of put it together. Like for our funds, we have a template, we kind of have a table that you input information into, and once you understand the kind of bigger picture, you can see how that works. But it's just really, you have to remember to balance that budget. The next point is to show your thinking. So in our applications, we ask explicitly, how did you come about these figures? So explain to us how you have selected these items and what their cost is. And so sometimes you might be asked explicitly, but even if you're not, I think it's really useful for a funder to understand how you've decided on this amount. So it could be that you're using pay scales like the Musicians Union pay scale, or equity, or any other kind of industry standard pay scale that you've found. It could be that you've received a quote, either for someone's time or for someone's services. They've said, this is how much I need to be paid. And that's how you have then decided to allocate that amount of money to your budget. If you're not using a pay scale or you aren't using quotes, then just break down the calculation. So say you've put hotel costs in as one of your budget lines and you've said the amount is 1,000, then just give a little breakdown, in brackets, this is 10 nights at 100, just so that people understand how that figure breaks down. Because again, it's really useful for a funder to see that you've thought through these amounts, that you haven't just plucked them out of the air. And especially important if you are applying to a fund that does give partial awards, that you have displayed really clearly where all the money's going, so that people understand that which bits are kind of vital to the project running or which bits could be kind of reduced. So yeah, just showing your thinking in terms of the amounts is really, really useful. I think something just sort of visually that's really good is to lay out your expenditure and income in categories. So to kind of look through the project and kind of categorize the artistic costs, and then the logistics, any materials or equipment you have to purchase, the kind of management of the project, any overheads, and to just split those up so that you can glance at a budget and you can hone in on the bit that you want to check. So this is just a kind of formatting thing that is really useful, and I'm sure Kenneth's budget template will cover that as well. But again, like the bullet points that I mentioned earlier in your narrative, it's just a way to make the important points stand out really clearly and avoid someone having to sort of hunt through some dense information to find the bit that they want to check for. And to that point, to make sure that your budget matches your narrative. This is something I have seen quite a lot. And again, I think it's mainly due to oversight. But we'll have, because almost always you read the narrative, so the questions that you answer, and then you see the budget at the end. So you read about the project and the people that are applying for it and what it's going to do for development and what the public engagement is and all those things. And then at the end, you see the budget. And sometimes there'll be something in the budget that you haven't seen referenced in the narrative. Sometimes there's now, there's an amount allocated for a videographer, and that's never been referenced in your narrative. Maybe that you've allocated funds to get a PR company, but you haven't mentioned that when you've talked about your public engagement. Again, this is oversight. It's not about trying to kind of hide information. I think it's just forgetting to put it in. But knowing that we read all the words and then the numbers, really important that those match up and that you don't forget to add something in that you've budgeted for just to reference, because that might be the element that ties it together. It might be that I've read an application and I think, well, that's fine, but it doesn't, I'm not completely convinced that the public engagement or the marketing, I'm not convinced that those aims are going to be achievable because this applicant doesn't have a track record in doing these kind of events. So this is all feeling a bit risky. But if in the budget there's allocation for a PR company, I would think, oh, great, okay. So although they don't have track record of doing it themselves, they're going to bring in someone who knows how to do it. Perfect. That's no longer a risk. Just make sure that everything you have in your budget is also mentioned in your application. This one feels like common sense, but again, you'll be surprised because usually the budget you do at the end of an application and you just want to get it done and sent away. Check all of the figures and all of the sums and all of the amounts a lot of times before you submit it, because these things they just kind of all blur into one thing, and it's very easy to forget something or put a decimal point in the wrong place or have things not add up. It's not the end of the world, but I think it does even kind of subconsciously give a reflection of the applicant to the funder if there's these kind of little things that don't tie up. So it's worth spending a bit of time just making sure all these things are together. They all make sense. Everything, runs very clearly from point A to point Z, and you've covered everything. And then, to build in a contingency, as I mentioned before. So, like Kenneth said, move between 4% and 10%. Does someone want to come in with a question, or is someone just talking to their child? I think maybe just talking to their child.
That was Abigail just talking there. She's muted herself now.
Okay, cool. So I mean, the specific amount is obviously relative to what your project costs, but including a contingency tells me that you've thought clearly about your finances, that you're probably in a good position to manage the finances properly, and it's heartening to see it in there. And like Katrina mentioned before, to also have contingency in terms of your project delivery is really useful as well. That tells me that you're going to be able to manage the project well, and you're not going to hit a roadblock if something changes. And then the last thing, which I've subtly made to seem more important than the rest of the things, is to make sure that people are paid properly. And that includes yourself. So often, the fees for individuals within a project aren't high enough. And the one thing that funders want to do is make sure that people are paid properly for their contributions, because we understand that arts and culture is propped up by people that outperform what they're being asked to do. So individual artists do an extraordinary amount of work for nothing. Sometimes it becomes so normalized that you don't even think about it as something that you could be paid for. But when you apply for funding, what you're doing is you're asking to deliver a piece of work that you feel is important, and you want to deliver it in a way that no one's out of pocket. And what that means is to make sure that everyone's paid properly for what they're contributing, and often that's someone's time. And if you're worried about a budget seeming too big, or you want to shave an amount off a budget, shave it off somewhere else. Don't shave it off people's fees. And actually, I'd go as far as saying that I would prefer that support in kind isn't people's time, because I'd prefer that that was actually covered properly. Because, like I say, so much of culture, people do that anyway. So if I was seeing support in kind, I would prefer it if it was, space or materials or something like that, rather than someone saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to give you 10 hours of my time. So just make sure that even though it might feel to you like a lot more money than you'd considered, sit down and work out how much every part of your project is going to cost and how much time it's going to cost, and make sure that everyone's paid properly. So often we see individual artists apply for a project and then they cut their own fee out. They say, so I'm not going to take a fee so that the artist can be paid a little bit more. And it's a mentality that we all work in, but it's one that funders certainly are in a position to avoid. What funders can't do is give you money for something you haven't asked for. I've never seen a situation where someone's gone, yes, you can have the money, but we're actually going to give you £2,000 more than you've asked for, because I see that you haven't asked for a project management fee and you really should have one. We can only give money for what's been asked. And so it's really important to really value the time of yourself and of the other people in your project. And if you feel like the budget's too big, take something else off, but don't take off people's fees. That's a very, very important thing that will be kind of looked at a decision-making level. So with that in mind, and I understand that's a lot of information to kind of throw at you, and like Adam and Kenneth said, this information will be sent to you afterwards, so you can spend as much time thinking about it as you want. But I wonder if anyone has any questions, either general or specific, that they want to talk through, either to me or to Kenneth or Adam or Katrina, to use this kind of last sort of 20 minutes or so just to have a chat about anything that's on people's minds. Then fire away, and I will just chat.
Kim, I'd like to ask a question about budgeting. As I say, through the discussion, it came up that there might be a slight difference between how things are done with in Ireland, or with the Irish Arts Council and the English Arts Council, about the, this year I've been involved in a couple of budgeting, a couple of applications in the UK, primarily through PRS Foundation, and there might be an advertised amount of funding that would be available, but the project and the cost of delivering the project might exceed that budget, that require, or that available budget grant. So, for instance, if there's a grant available for £6,000, but the budget of the project is £10,000, how is that dealt with in the UK?
So Arts Council England doesn't give partial awards. So if the amount of money required for a project exceeds the budget, then the project isn't funded at all.
Okay.
In Scotland, it is similar to Ireland, so there's partial awards. So the decision making is kind of, the first half decision making is which projects are we going to support. The second half of the decision making is how much are we going to give them each. Whereas Arts Council, I guess, made the decision that, the amount that the applicant has stated is required, then we'll honour that amount, or we'll ask them to come back in. Yeah, so there's never a partial award that's made.
and sometimes, well, then obviously if applicants are aware of your stance on this situation, applicants might manipulate their application so that it reflects that the cost of the budget is 6,000, but you as experienced funders might take a look at it and say that can't be delivered for 6,000. Or, you know, in a way we're talking about this contingency thing again. So then how do you as funders look on that proposal, even though you know it can't be delivered for that money? For instance, a perfect example would be a management company like myself. I might have an artist in the UK. The grant might be for 6,000. I know it's going to cost 10,000. I'm quite happy to come in and subsidize the project for the other 4,000 if we can get 6,000 from the Arts Council. And to me, that would seem a very logical way of going about it. But from your side as a funder, you might take the view that this project can't be delivered for 6,000, and again, you might reject it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, and this is something that you can kind of factor into your budget, and just a little sentence in your narrative where you can reflect that you're asking for, you know, presumably in most cases you're asking for the top amount of the ask, but that you understand the kind of global cost of the entire project is more than that. So you can actually highlight in your budget which costs are going to be covered by the grant and which costs are going to be covered by something else. Yeah. So that we can see, so our £6,000 is going to those 4 things, but I see that these things are not going to be covered. So that there's, we just understand that there's kind of other income sources. So you can kind of flag that up on a budget as well, is how I'd suggest you go about that.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Rena has a question.
Oh,
Rena has a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. The question is about the touring grant. And as a venue programmer, do you have any advice on when you're approaching venues and you're planning a tour that really, if you don't get the grant, it doesn't go ahead, kind of thing? I found that difficult in the past when I'm speaking to promoters or venues and saying, it all feels very hypothetical. You know, you kind of want to set things in stone, and obviously the venues want to put things in their calendar. But at the same time, I feel like you're in this middle ground. You're like, if we get the grant, this will happen. If we don't, it won't. Anyway, advice on how to approach all that.
Yeah, I'm sure Kenneth will have something on this as well. But so in the English system, you are asked if you have, you know, tour dates, it'll say, is the tour date confirmed, or is it under discussion, or is it not yet discussed? And so we don't say that everything has to be confirmed before you apply, because we understand that's unreasonable. So we usually see a mixture of confirmed things and discussed things. Obviously, the more confirmed, the better. But I think it's really important to know that confirmed, as we understand it, is confirmed subject to funding. So we don't expect anyone or any venue to agree to something that will put them in kind of financial pressure if the funding doesn't come through. So, and as a venue, a programmer at a venue, I'll see this quite a lot. So you'll have someone who says, I'm putting this tour together, but it is dependent on funding. So I have this date free, and it'd be great if we could play there. But just to reiterate, we cannot do that unless we get funding. Then I'm happy to confirm subject to funding if that's a gig we want to put on. And I also realise it might not come off. Now, as long as there's proper lead time, so that you don't tell me you didn't get the funding 2 days before the gig, so that you've worked in enough time to sort of deal, this is the contingency we were talking about, make sure that there's enough time for a little bit of switching and swapping to go on, then that's fine to be confirmed. And it's the same for people's individual involvement in a project. They can say, yes, I'd absolutely love to do your project, but obviously I can only do it if I get paid. And that is confirmed as far as we're concerned, because that's subject to funding. So I don't know, Kenneth, if you have anything to add on that, because I guess it's something that we see quite a lot, isn't it, where things are dependent on some funding to go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like on balance, I suppose the more that is confirmed, the better, you know. So like, let's say it was a tour with 7 shows. If 4 of those shows were confirmed, obviously the balance, you know, the tipping point has already been reached, and it makes the rest of the TBCs far more robust looking. You know, again, if you had 7 shows and 6 of them were kind of more pale pencils or TBCs, it just means that it kind of, it indicates that the prep for the budget or the prep for the application mightn't be at an advanced enough stage in order for it to be delivered. I mean, there's lots of ways kind of to look at it, but I certainly think that, you know, when it comes to budgeting and for the artists, payments, etc., that's all subject to the grant being awarded. So I don't see any problem there. But I think it comes down as well to supporting documents, like support letters from venues. You know, if you, you know, like we have a situation in Ireland where an arts centre will write a memorandum of understanding or a letter of agreement to say that, you know, yes, they supported subject to funding. I mean, that's as good as a confirmed gig. And I think that if you're making an application, you should be looking to have those type of letters lined up, because it means that you've had the conversation, even if it's a cursory one, and it's a very important additional document to have. So it doesn't have to be confirmed, it just has to kind of, I think if you outline it well in the application and you have the supporting documentation, I think it's as good as confirmed. As far as I see Katrina has her hand up.
Yeah, well, I know this isn't answering Rina's question at all, but if you are booked for something, Arts Council Ireland won't fund it because they consider it as already having happened. I don't know if that's specific to the Festival Investment Scheme or it's a general thing. I think it's a general thing. So that's why everything has to be memorandum of understanding, a letter of support. It can't actually be a booking, or it has already happened and then they won't fund it. So that's just something to consider. I know like every letter of support that I've ever written has subject to funding like written into it, because on the off chance that they consider it to be a booking rather than an understanding.
I think just to add to that, it's a good point,
That's
Katrina.
a good point.
I think to add to that, I mean, every fund, be it from wherever, will have guidelines. And I mean, I know it seems incredibly pedestrian, you know, to say, you know, read the guidelines, but, you know, and you know, sometimes the guidelines look the same, you know, with all the red words and the white, you know what I mean? It looks the same. We'll have new information in it. So it might seem like a really obvious thing, but if you read the guidelines, it's going to actually guide you into crafting the best possible, putting your application, you know, relative to what the guidelines are asking. It's very, very helpful. And I think a lot of people just go, yeah, it's another thing and I got to do this, that, and the other. But read the guidelines 100% before you commit anything. One thing I wanted to add, which I hope that answers your question somewhat, Rina, but I think that,
yes,
what did I want to add? Oh, cool. I just want to really reiterate the point that Kim made about paying the artist, paying both themselves and the other people involved in the project, whatever it may be. Again, as I've said, I've had a look at quite a lot of artist budgets, and the first thing that goes is the payment to themselves as an artist. And I think that I think it's a pervasive issue, that people are like, okay, I got to get this budget down. Or you might be writing a budget where there is no associated income because the project itself doesn't really have associated income. And that's okay, you know, if that's the nature of the fund. But I always say a really good place to put income is support in kind. You know, you can be a little bit creative, I suppose, with that. But if you get additional help, you know, you can equate that to hours worked on your behalf as support in kind. And if you outline it very clearly like that, you now have income. Now, of course, you have to put it on the expenditure side so it cancels itself out. But now you have a budget that optically looks better because it has some income associated with it. And for me, that always looks more robust. And it also helps to kind of, you know, make it look better. But then you have people taking out the contingency, which I don't recommend. And you have people taking out the payments to themselves. Now, you know, if any application, and this is my own view on it, I suppose. If an artist isn't paying themselves and they're paying other artists involved in the project a low fee, it's never going to get anywhere, no matter how interesting the proposal is, just never going to get off the ground. And if artists, are looking to, if artists realize that a fund is competitive, and an artist may believe that if they cut out the fee to themselves to bring down the overall budget, that they might have a better chance. I don't think that helps your case at all. And on a more global level, we're undervaluing the art itself by not putting the true cost of what this thing is. And so many times musicians have come to IMC and they've said, okay, look, I have a budget and it's a little bit high, and and my first question is this the true cost of the project? You know what I mean? Like, don't kind of like create a budget for the award, which is unrealistic. And if most of them say, well, there's no contingency, so we've got to add that. Now the budget starts to go up, but we need to be putting in applications to all funding agents that reflect the true cost of the work, 100%, plus a contingency, because that reinforces the value, the cost of creating art. And I think that a lot of people just really just start chipping away at the budget by not paying without the artist creating the music, we have nothing, nothing at all.
And then those budgets can help to the funder to decide whether there needs to be more money in a fund or they need to ask government for more money. They can use those budgets to say, look, this is the cost of these activities that we want to support, so we do need more money. And it's like that. It's the issue where if you don't tell people the work that you're doing and you don't tell people the value of it, no one is going to ask you about it. No one is going to ask, do you need some more money? Because it doesn't feel like you've asked for it. Like, you have to put your own value on your work. So it's really important. And like Kenneth says, it devalues the work, and it also puts everyone in a tough position to make sure, just more broadly, that government understands the value of the work as well, because ultimately it's them that we're trying to convince to allocate 0.1% more of their budget to.
Yeah, we did. Sorry, Dominic. I'll come back to you in a second. Dominic, I just wanted to say that we did a survey there. A musician survey, a national survey. It was very, very interesting, and we're going to publish before Christmas the results of that. We actually had a jazz connector on it, but I think, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. Maybe Katrina will probably put me right as usual. But I think that the success rate of applicants to the Irish Arts Council was around the 75% or something like that. So like almost, I think almost 3/4 of applications were successful, which means obviously that 25% plus were not successful. But I think that's a really good batting average for people who make regular applications to funding agencies. And I think when you zoomed it out to like Culture Ireland and maybe PRS and other things, it went down a little bit. But overall, I mean, if you make 10 applications, there's a good chance 4 or 5 of them are going to get through.
Yeah, but probably good to remember that probably over the next 12 months, that might be slightly lower.
Oh, listen, things have gone to hell in a handbasket. I mean, there just simply is not. I think this is highlighted. I mean, I'm not going to get into it now, but it is highlighted the disparity between, commercial industry and the arts. How they're been viewed by government, because commercial industries get X, Y, Z bailouts, and they're very tangible to address the actual losses that have been. You know what I mean? Like, so if people work in the business of goods, you have got these tangible losses. But I mean, art is a little bit more nebulous sometimes, and the creative practices. But it's just the bailout situation, let's say, and I know it's the same. Well, I know England has done a better job than us, but yeah, I mean, it's there needs to be more consideration given to that, because it's acute. It's beyond acute.
Well, to put it into perspective, the annual spend in the UK for culture is 1/28 what the recent increase in military spend is. So not the base level, but what they've just announced as the increase is 28 times what culture receives as their normal base rate funding. So we might have done marginally better in allocating emergency funds, but it is not a good position.
Dominic, you had something there you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Kim, and it was a point that you touched on a couple of moments ago, about going back to budgets. how would the Arts Council in England deal with budgets that are presented where say a touring budget, and in a touring budget you're obviously going to have expenses, but you're also going to have some income, and presumably income will be coming from performance and fees, but one from guaranteed performance fees or two from door splits. So how does, but it's obviously how long is a piece of string kind of question. Sure. And it's very, very difficult to give a definitive answer as to what the income of a project will be. The project, it might be a touring or it might be an album, and therefore you don't know how much money is going to be raised from the income of, or revenue is going to be raised from the sale of the album. So how does the Art Council in England deal with the income side of a budget?
So similar to the venue question, are you confirmed, under discussion, not yet discussed? In the income section, we'll ask, is this pot of income confirmed, or is it pending a decision, or is it projected? So obviously, if you're planning on making income from ticket sales or merch sales or whatever, it's going to be projected. And so I guess if we see some projected income, one question we'll ask is that projection reasonable? So, for example, if you have projected that on your 7-date tour, you are going to, your ticket income is essentially 100% capacity at those 7 venues, we might argue that it is not a reasonable projection. If you have decided to put your ticket sales at, say, 60% of capacity, you might feel like that's more reasonable. If you can back up your projection, so I've projected it at 95% because I've played at these venues, 8 times in the last 11 years, and they've always been completely sold out, then fine. If you have evidence to back up your projection, then that's okay. So again, it comes down to sort of, is this a reasonable amount? I guess there is a kind of, broadly, there's an understanding that a budget for a project before you receive the money and deliver the project, and what it looks like at the end, is obviously those are going to be different. So we understand that some things will cost more, some things will cost less, some things will not have been budgeted for and then will have come up and you'll have had to pay for them. And the same goes for income. You might have income which is ticket sales, and you might have projected something that was very reasonable, that we felt was a good projection, but you still might have come under for whatever reason. And that's okay. I mean, we understand that either the fluctuations in your expenditure will have meant that that was okay, or you might have had to cut something out, you've made some decision. And all of those things are okay. And usually at the end of a project, a funder will ask for some kind of final report, some sort of evaluation, and it's really useful to not kind of sugarcoat that when you give evaluation. So you say, this is what worked and this is what didn't, because it's not usually asked as a kind of punitive measure. We're not asking so that we can punish you for having lower, ticket sales than we thought you'd have. We're asking so that we can understand, are there kind of fragile bits of a project that we can do something to kind of improve on? Is this obstacle that you faced in your project, is that isolated, or are we seeing that kind of across the board? Is there some kind of wider trend that we can sort of intervene on or something? So this kind of like projected income is something that we see all the time, and it's absolutely fine that it is, again, similar to the other stuff on the budget. Just give us a justification for the amount, and if the justification seems reasonable, then fine.
Sure.
Kenneth, are we? Do we?
I think we're pretty much out of time. I mean, we've time for one more question if anybody wants to, has something burning. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, well,
we've answered
we don't. Fantastic. Okay, so everybody has everything they need. The one thing I just wanted to add, and I meant to say it earlier actually, is I know that the Arts Council you know, many other agents do provide budget templates, and they provide them often in line at the bottom of an application. And you know, they're fine, but they're quite global in nature. You know, they're like summary budgets in a way. And I think that I do think that people who in their supporting materials who add a more detailed, categorized budget do have a better chance, because the business aspect of the application looks far more robust. So that's just something like I think I would recommend, even if it's not asked for, but you have the capacity to provide supporting information. You can refer in the application, the main body of the application, to the detailed budget. Still fill in the global budget, obviously, but you know, just show that this is how you've broken it down. I mean, it always looks better, and that way you can cost out your different things and wages and hourly rates and all those other things, and maybe if there's VAT and stuff involved. I mean, we get questions all the time about VAT, and you know, if you're not registered for VAT, you will have to, you'll have to pay VAT. You can't put in ex-VAT prices. And probably one of the biggest area that I see people falling down is they get an ex-VAT quote from a supplier, and then they put in that ex-VAT quote, and then they get the invoice from the supplier, but of course the VAT is added. And if you're not registered for VAT, you're going to have to pay that full amount. That's going to screw your budget up straight away, and that's going to make delivery of the project a lot more difficult. Granted, you know, some artists aren't dealing with suppliers in a commercial capacity, but if you were recording an album for release and you're dealing with physical product, all of those services have VAT on them. So that's just something to consider as well, I suppose.
I think it's useful also to remember that those questions about, you know, budget and itemized budgeting, financial management, project timelines, public engagement, those questions are really useful for you to answer as well. Like this, all of this stuff should make your project better and make it, you know, be delivered more strongly. I guess it's easy to feel like you're jumping through hoops for a funder, but the questions tend to be, I'm sure there are exceptions, but they tend to be things that you can use, you know, in your own management of the project to make it work. So if you have an itemized budget, it's going to be much easier to keep track of your cash flow and kind of make changes if they need to be made and monitor stuff. If you've thought really clearly about your target audience groups, it's going to be easier to get people to your gigs. So it's not, don't feel like the application for funding and the project are two separate things. They can all be one thing.
Good advice. Listen, Kim, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us. I know that I know we're in December in what has been an unprecedentedly mental year. So thanks for joining us. As I said, we will be putting this one up on our YouTube in due course. We will also, in a couple of days, be sending out, you know, all of the associated documents plus that budget template, which we'll do in Google Sheets, that everyone can use. So the next Jazz Connector is on January the 7th. And it'll be with Mr. Matt Fripp from jazzfuel.com. You can check out his website in advance at jazzfuel.com. So he'll be joining us on the 7th of January. And it's a great opportunity to get your house in order as an artist in terms of the public side of what you do. I see Katrina has put it in there. So it's just left for me to say thank you, Kim. Thanks a million for joining us. Really appreciate you know, giving us your insight there and being so candid about the work in Arts Council England, which I said is universal.